On August 13th, 2018, a husband in a quiet Colorado suburb called police to report that his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters had vanished without a trace. 3 days later, he would admit that he knew exactly where they were, because he was the one who had put them there. This is the Reckoning Files. Shanann and Chris Watts had met on Facebook in 2010, both transplants from small-town North Carolina, and married 2 years later. In 2012, they moved to Colorado to start a new life together, eventually settling in Frederick, a fast-growing town about 30 miles north of Denver. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, one of the region's biggest oil and gas employers. Shanann built a second income and a devoted following through direct sales, posting near-daily videos of family outings, backyard afternoons, and her daughters singing along to the radio in the back seat. To the thousands of people who followed her online, Shanann's page looked like the highlight reel of a family that had it all: a growing business, a new home, and 2 little girls who adored her. Bella, 4, was the quiet, nurturing one. Friends remember her constantly talking to her mother's belly, excited about the baby on the way. Celeste, not yet 3, was the opposite. Full speed, always climbing on something, a family nickname of Rampage, attached to her from toddlerhood. Weeks before, Shanann had announced a 3rd child was coming, a son the couple had already picked a name for: Nico. Friends and family remember Shanann herself as warm, funny, and fiercely devoted to her girls. That same visibility would matter later. When a woman who posted every single day suddenly went silent, the people who knew her noticed almost immediately. On the morning of August 13th, a friend drove Shanann home after a business trip out of town. By early afternoon, she had missed a scheduled doctor's appointment and gone quiet on the platform she used every day of her life. And the people closest to her knew that wasn't like her at all. By that evening, Shanann's friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, still hadn't been able to reach her by phone or text. Atkinson drove to the Watts house, got no answer at the door, and called the Frederick Police Department for a welfare check. Officers arrived to find the house empty. Chris told them his wife and daughters had left that morning for a friend's house, and that he didn't know where they'd gone after that. Investigators weren't convinced, and they started digging into his account. Atkinson would later say publicly that she sensed something was seriously wrong well before anyone had confirmed the family was gone. What investigators found over the following 2 days was a second, hidden version of Chris Watts's life. For about 2 months, he had been having an affair with a co-worker at Anadarko named Nicole Kessinger, all while continuing to appear, smiling, in Shanann's public family photos. Kessinger, investigators would later determine, had no knowledge of what Chris had done and was not involved in planning it. Investigators concluded that Chris wanted out of his marriage, and that rather than leave it, in the early hours of August 13th, inside the family's own home, he killed Shanann. A short time afterward, he killed Bella and Celeste as well. He then drove roughly 40 miles northeast to Survey 319, an oil and gas work site he serviced for his employer, to hide what he had done before returning home to report his family missing. The same story he would go on to repeat to police, to reporters, and to Shanann's own frightened friends. When Colorado Bureau of Investigation agents sat Chris Watts down for a polygraph on August 14th, he failed it, and detectives noticed something else. He had already begun referring to his wife and daughters in the past tense, before anyone outside his own family knew whether they were even hurt. The polygraph didn't just fail to clear Chris Watts. It accelerated an investigation that had already begun to close in on him. Detectives confronted him with what they had pulled from his phone and computer. Messages and records tying him to Nicole Kessinger. He admitted to the affair. Earlier that same day, Chris had appeared on local television, pleading for his family's safe return, telling a reporter that not knowing was tearing him apart. Investigators now had reason to doubt every word of it. Then, on August 15th, less than 48 hours after he had first reported his family missing, Watts began to talk to investigators in earnest. His first account still wasn't the truth. He initially claimed he had killed Shanann only after walking in on her, harming their daughters. A version of events he would later admit was false. Under further questioning, he acknowledged what investigators had already started to suspect, that he alone was responsible for all 3 deaths, and that he had gone to his own worksite afterward to conceal what he had done. Watts marked the locations for investigators on an aerial photograph of the property. That night, and into the next day, recovery teams searched Survey 319, the site outside Frederick where Watts worked. Bella and Celeste's bodies were recovered from separate crude oil storage tanks on the property. Shanann's body was found in a shallow grave nearby, on the same site. What had been a 5-day missing persons search was now, unmistakably, a homicide investigation. And the man who had gone on local television days earlier to plead for his family's safe return was under arrest for their murders. Within days, Weld County prosecutors filed 9 charges against him, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, and 1 count of unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, a charge tied to the son she had been carrying. Watts would later, in a much longer prison interview months afterward, add further detail to his account, none of it changing what had already been established, and none of it necessary to repeat here. Prosecutors initially signaled they would seek the death penalty. That changed by early November, when Weld County's district attorney announced a plea agreement, reached in significant part at the request of Shanann's own parents, who said publicly that they wanted the case resolved without more death attached to it. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 counts: first-degree murder for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and tampering with each of their bodies. There was no trial. There was no dispute about what he had done, only his own admission of guilt, entered into the official court record. At sentencing on November 19th, Shanann's family and friends addressed the court directly, describing who Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had been to them, not only what had happened to them. The judge then handed down 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, 3 of them running consecutively, along with an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination charge and 36 years for tampering with the bodies. However, the individual terms were structured on paper. The outcome was singular. Chris Watts will die in prison. Not long after, he was moved out of Colorado to a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, a transfer officials attributed to his safety, given how widely the case had already been covered. Chris Watts has given a handful of prison interviews in the years since, offering additional, and at times shifting, detail about that night and about his own state of mind. None of it has changed the legal outcome, and none of it is needed to understand what a guilty plea, entered in open court, already settled. In 2020, a documentary built largely from Shanann's own social media footage and law enforcement recordings became one of the most watched true crime releases on Netflix, introducing the family's story to millions of viewers who had never heard their names before. Shanann's parents have spent the years since asking people to remember their daughter and granddaughters as they were, not only as a headline, directing memorial donations towards the Lupus Foundation of America in honor of a condition Shanann lived with, and toward organizations that support missing persons cases and children in crisis. Nicole Kessinger, for her part, was never charged, cooperated with investigators once she learned the truth, and has largely stayed out of public view since. In Frederick, neighbors still return, quietly, to the street where the family once lived. That's the case file on Chris Watts and the Frederick family murders. A guilty plea, 5 life sentences, and a family that deserved to be remembered as more than the way it ended. If you want the next case file, subscribe. New files drop Monday and Thursday.